Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining me. My name is Gerard Thornton, and welcome to my presentation on Mabel Normand, Queen of the Silent Comedy. I was born and raised in Coney Island, New York, and I spent my entire adult life in the maritime industry. And aside from my interest in ships in the sea, I also I'm very fond of silent movies and old movies. And that's why it's a pleasure for me to do this presentation on Mabel Normand. Now, Mabel Normand may not be a household name in the year 2021, but back in her day, she was one of the most popular and successful actresses of the early movie industry. You may be wondering why we're speaking about a movie star at Sailors Snug Harbor. Good question. Just so happens that Mabel Normand got her start in this very same neighborhood, just outside the gates, where she lived with her family at 91 Tysen Street. Her father, Claude, not only built the house they lived in, but he also worked here at Snug Harbor. He wore several hats for the establishment. He was a carpenter, an electrician, and he was also the stage manager. Whenever Snug Harbor put on a show to entertain the sailors here, it was Claude's job to make sure all the sets were built and that the performances were up to their standards. And as Claude had said himself, these sailors had been around the world, they've seen everything, and whenever the jokes were not to their satisfaction, they would get up in mass and clear out of the music hall. So Claude was a very busy guy. Now, living in the Normand house in Staten Island was Claude, his wife Mary, Mabel, her sister Gladys, and her brother Claude Jr. Tragically, Mabel's other brother passed away at the age of 12 from tuberculosis, a disease that killed about 100,000 people in the United States every year at that time. And it was a disease that was going to come back to haunt the Normand family later on. Growing up in Staten Island, Mabel Normand was to become a fairly vivacious and spirited woman. And she spent a lot of time on the beaches in Staten Island, diving and swimming. She became an excellent athlete in the water, and this would help her out in the years to come when she entered the movie industry. Now, the Normand family was a close-knit and religious family. They were working class, so they found it hard to make ends meet on Claude's income alone. And back then, it was very common for young children to be put out in the workforce to help support the family with any kind of money they can earn. And at the age of 14, Mabel Normand did just that. She actually took the Staten Island ferry into Manhattan and applied for a position with the Botanical company. Botanical at the time, and still does, it's a enormous manufacturer of dress patterns. They designed garments for men, women, and children. And in 1906, Mabel was hired to work in the mailroom. Soon after she was hired, her superintendent found her far too pretty to be stuck in a mailroom. With her big brown eyes and her brown hair, she was quickly sent to the art department, where she was hired as what they called a poser, a model today. And as a poser, she would sit in the latest fashions of the company, and she would be illustrated by commercial artists. And these pictures would be published in their Delineator magazine, which had widespread distribution throughout the country and throughout the world. So Mabel was seen by a lot of people from her work as a model. During this time, she also posed for other commercial artists, including some of the most renowned of the time, including Charles Dana Gibson and Montgomery Flagg, who was known for his iconic Coca-Cola advertisements of the late 1800s. So the income that Mabel was bringing in was very much welcomed by the family. She was making about $3 a day to pose. And she did this for a couple of years, until she was asked by a friend of hers, who was another model, if Mabel wanted to come along with her and sit in for a film shoot. Now, back then, in these days, the film industry was very much in its infancy. It was a very ragtag group of individuals that shot films with very little budget. There was often no plot, and a lot of times the actors would improvise the action as the movie was being filmed. So Mabel Normand at this time was looking for anything new and interesting, and she decided to join her friend to watch from behind the scenes as this early film was being shot. So Mabel Normand gets her first glimpse into movie making, and it's a crazy and hectic job, but she finds it fascinating. And she winds up doing it for a few years, getting in trouble with her mother for staying out late when the film shoots ran long, but she enjoyed the work. At this time, she met a part-time actor, part-time director by the name of Sennett, who worked with Biograph motion pictures, and he had taken a liking to Mabel, and they would strike up a friendship that was to continue for the rest of Mabel's life. And they started off as co-stars in some of the Biograph movies. So in 1910, Biograph announced that they were going to do some filming on the West Coast, but they weren't going to use Mabel out there. So she wound up getting work for the Vitagraph company in Brooklyn at the time. And at the time, she was working with some actors that were going to become very prominent in the industry, including John Bunny, Norma Talmadge, and a young Canadian upstart by the name of Mary Pickford. So she was in great company at Vitagraph, and she got a lot of experience doing comedies at this studio. However, she was fired from Vitagraph after a little while, and thankfully she found out that Biograph had come back with Sennett and the rest of her former colleagues to work on the East Coast. So she rejoined with Biograph, and at this time she was told that the company was going to relocate out to California, a town called Edendale, California, and this time she was going to go along with them. So in 1912, upon the arrival in California, Sennett comes up with the idea that he had been doing directing of comedies for Biograph for long enough, and he was going to open his own movie studio. And he opened Keystone Motion Pictures at the time in 1912. And 1912 was going to prove to be a very pivotal year for Mabel Normand and Sennett, because Sennett asked Mabel to join him on his new venture, and she agrees at the tune of $150 a week. So her income has increased considerably from her days as a model. And together they were going to start making their own comedies, and Sennett was going to prove to be very successful in this venture. And for those who don't know anything about Sennett, Mabel Normand, or silent movies, the term Keystone Cops is probably an image that people know about today for any reason, and it's bumbling police officers going after a suspect. And that troupe of entertainers was developed in Sennett's studio, and it became one of his two go-to tropes that he would introduce to the public, to his audiences. One was the Keystone Cops, and the other was his Sennett Bathing Beauties, which is basically women wearing bathing suits and doing not much more than frolicking in the ocean. And for this reason, Mabel Normand fit the bill perfectly, because she was an excellent swimmer and a high diver, and she was able to join the cast and give the people what they want in this department. So in 1913, the studio hired a new up-and-coming actor from vaudeville. His name was Roscoe Arbuckle, and he went by the nickname Fatty. It was a nickname he didn't care for, but it was one that would make him instantly recognizable in the industry. So Roscoe and Mabel became fast friends, and they worked together very closely and very successfully in a number of comedies for Keystone, and their relationship and friendship would last for many years to come. Keystone increased its viewership now at this point, and in 1914, Sennett and Mabel Normand were out on the town in New York City watching a play, and they came across a young English actor who caught their attention. And after the show, they actually came up to him and asked if he'd like to sign with their studio for a year contract. The man by the name of Charles Chaplin agreed to these terms, and he signed with Keystone in 1914. So with Mabel Normand, Charlie Chaplin, and Roscoe Arbuckle, Keystone was positioning itself to be quite a successful movie studio. Now, even though Roscoe and Mabel worked together well, Charlie Chaplin and Mabel did not. They butted heads continuously, mainly because at this point Mabel felt that she had achieved a place of prominence in the studio and in the industry and deserved to be calling some of the shots. Charlie Chaplin, of course, wasn't one to take direction from many people, especially from a petite 5-foot woman that he had just met. So it took a while for them working together to sort of come to an agreement. In fact, Charlie Chaplin had a hard time catching on with audiences, and Mack Sennett almost fired him because he wasn't getting the return on his movies that he had expected. And it was thanks in large part to Mabel Normand that Charlie Chaplin wasn't fired. She helped him through his formative year at Keystone, and while at Keystone, he was able to develop a character that really connected with the audiences, and that was the tramp, which was Charlie Chaplin's most famous character. He only worked there for a year before going out on his own and becoming part of motion picture history. In 1915, the Mack and Mabel relationship had grown to a place where the two decided they were going to get married. It was a marriage that everybody thought was inevitable, but at the same time, it was a marriage that was never to be. They were notorious for their on-set bickering, where some of their brawls would spill out from the studio offices right onto the set where they were filming. And the term Mack and Mabel was synonymous with a Hollywood couple, trying to make things happen even though the odds were stacked against them. Unfortunately, the wedding plans for July 4th, 1915 never came through, and the wedding was postponed indefinitely. Apparently, Mack Sennett had trouble with commitment, and he also had expected any wife of his would be tending house, and that's not a lifestyle that Mabel would have entertained by any means. So in 1917, Roscoe Arbuckle leaves Keystone Movie Studio to set out on his own, and this leaves Mack Sennett with an issue. He just lost 2 of his star players. Now that makes Mabel Normand his key, and she was notorious for doing all of the stunts in her movies, and that included scaling down ropes from hot air balloons, doing high dives, climbing down roofs, and she also wound up in one scene flying in an early Curtiss biplane that almost ended in tragedy when the pilot's engine cut off in mid-flight. He was able to restart the engine just in the nick of time. So Mabel Normand, throughout her daredevil performances, really made a name for herself, and she started to realize that she was worth more to the studio than even Mack would agree. So her salary was increased to $1,500 a week, which is pretty good money back then. And to sweeten the deal, Mack Sennett says, "Mabel, I'm going to give you your own movie studio." And this was something that Mabel Normand had always thought was a great idea. She was looking forward to working on her own, producing and directing films, and this was greatly welcomed by Mabel. So the Mabel Normand Motion Picture Company was started in 1917. While she was working there, she was hard at work on a production called Mickey that she starred in, and one of her co-stars, Lou Cody, was one of the leading men. And this movie was going to be a late blooming success, and at the time it didn't have a lot of interest from distributors, so it was shelved. So in 1917, with Mickey still on the shelf, Mabel Normand turned her attention to politics because the hostilities in Europe were threatening the peace not only in the nation but all around the world. And she wound up attending several peace rallies as well as war bond drives. And it's a funny story that one evening in Harlem, Mabel Normand announced to the assembled crowd of some 10,000 people that whoever would pledge to buy a war bond, she would kiss them. So automatically, all the men in the audience stampeded to the front and pledged money for the war effort. And obviously, they made a lot of money that night, thanks to Mabel Normand. In 1917, Mabel Normand contracts tuberculosis. Again, this was a very serious disease, and it was not curable at the time. It was treated to some success, but it was not something that went away very readily. And she started to take medication to help her with her breathing, because it became very difficult for her to breathe. And tuberculosis was going to afflict her in the years ahead. Now, in 1918, Mickey is finally released, this movie that had been on the shelf for a while, and it is a smash hit. It really turns things around for Mack Sennett, who was looking for his next big vehicle, and this was it. And to his surprise, after Mickey is presented to the public, Mabel announces that she's going to be leaving the studio. So a few years later, she leaves the studio. Again, Mack Sennett is looking for his stars, and he gets some. In fact, his Mack Sennett Bathing Beauties was used as a sort of a springboard for many of the most popular actresses of the day, including Carol Lombard, Gloria Swanson, and Marie Prevost. They all started in Mack Sennett's Bathing Beauties ensemble. In 1920, Mabel signs with Samuel Goldwyn. At this point in her career, she realizes she can do things on her own without the support of Mack Sennett, and she signed at the salary of $2,500 a week, which is over $1 million in today's currency, which isn't bad for a female star at the time. In fact, in 1924, Clara Bow was only making about $900 a week. So Mabel Normand is definitely one of the higher paid actresses. And now she's got a lot of experience under her belt, including directing and producing movies in her own studio, which makes her a very early pioneer of female movie makers. In 1921, Mabel Normand decides to go back with Mack Sennett, her old friend. And at this point, she knows what her worth is in the industry, and she's able to demand a $4,000 a week salary. And this is big money. As a comparison, however, Charlie Chaplin in 1916 was getting paid $10,000 a week. So even though Mabel Normand was making money, Charlie Chaplin had really made things happen for himself, and he had his start in Keystone Studios, and he always remembered Mabel Normand very fondly because of her support of his career. Now, the early 1920s were going to usher in a bit of a change for Mabel's career. Her relationship with Roscoe Arbuckle was going to come back to haunt her through no fault of her own. Now, Roscoe Arbuckle was accused of being involved somehow in the death of a young actress by the name of Virginia Rappe during one of his parties. He was accused of somehow causing her death. After several trials, Roscoe was completely exonerated. However, the damage was done. The public and some of her contemporaries thought that Mabel was maybe bad news and she was hanging out with the wrong crowd. This was to be furthered by the tragic murder of famed director William Desmond Taylor. And investigators found out that just before his death, Mabel Normand was the last person to be seen coming out of his apartment before he was found dead of a gunshot wound. So she was grilled by the authorities to find out what she was doing there and what happened, but she really had nothing to do with it. She was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was a crime that was never solved, and the murderer was never apprehended. But you have this 1-2 punch for Mabel, her relationship with Roscoe Arbuckle, and now the William Desmond Taylor murder that doesn't put her in a good light. So at this point, her appeal for the studios is somewhat dimmed. And in 1923, she stars in her last movie with Sennett. She starts to work a little bit less. Her health is somewhat failing her. It's the tuberculosis is making her having a hard time getting around and being as active on the set as she used to be. And in 1926, she signs a contract with Hal Roach Studios, and this was where she would end her career. In 1926, she also stuns the motion picture industry and her fans by eloping with her one-time co-star, Lou Cody. Nobody really knew what the attraction was between the two, but it turned out to be a somewhat interesting relationship that evolved between the two. They didn't know if the two did this as some sort of gag or a stunt or a publicity stunt, but Lou Cody would come through at the end by being a very welcome and supportive friend for Mabel Normand. In 1929, September of 1929, Mabel Normand finds that her health is too bad, it's failed her too much to let her still work on the sets. And she's admitted to the Pottinger Sanitarium in Monrovia, California. Now, this sanitarium was considered cutting edge for its day. Again, tuberculosis was not easily treated, but this was the place where people went to if they wanted the latest in treatment for diseases of that nature. She actually received a groundbreaking blood transfusion at that sanitarium, but unfortunately it was a little too late. All of her former co-stars, the motion picture industry, and her fans sent her numerous gifts, cards, and well wishes while she was at the facility. Her father, Claude, dies in early February of 1930, but the family believes that the news of his death would be too much of a shock for Mabel to handle, so they never tell her. Her husband, Lou Cody, sits at her bedside whenever he's able to, and he talks with her, and they share memories and jokes, and then he sends a note that he'll be coming to visit her again. Unfortunately, he suffers a heart attack, and he's not able to visit her, and the day after this happens, Mabel Normand passes away in her sleep at the age of 37 on February 23rd, 1930, which was a huge shock to the industry and to her fans. She had come a long way. She had basically been one of the actors and actresses that started an industry from scratch, whereas the up-and-coming group of actors and actresses, such as Barbara Stanwyck, Joan Blondell, Katharine Hepburn, they would have Mabel's work to draw on for their experience. Mabel did not. She was one of that troupe of pioneers that started it and built an industry from the ground up. And much to her credit, the comedians of the later decades would have her to thank for what she gave to them. The funeral for Mabel Normand was considered on par or maybe even more elaborate than that of Valentino's. Everyone from the motion picture industry was there. It was a veritable who's who of stars. Showing up at the funeral was Marion Davies, Gloria Swanson, Mary Pickford, D.W. Griffith, Douglas Fairbanks, and of course, her old pals from the Keystone days, Mack Sennett, co-stars Ford Sterling, Fred Mace, and Charlie Chaplin. Mabel Normand was presented a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame in 1960. And although her memory has faded quite a bit since her days in the industry, her life was recalled in a somewhat loose fashion in the 1974 Broadway show, Mack and Mabel. So Mabel Normand Mabel Normand's career spanned only about 2 decades, but in this time, her work greatly influenced the motion picture industry as a whole, and especially the making of comedies. Also, her ability to do her own stunts, as well as work successfully in front of the camera and behind the camera, make her someone we can't soon forget. And that's why it's an honor for me here to talk about Mabel Normand, and I hope you've come away with a better understanding of who she was and what she did and why she's important to the movie business. So again, thanks for joining me. My name is Gerard Thornton. Be well and be safe. see more videos in the Noble on Watch series, visit noblemaritime.org/NOW.